my great honor and privilege to introduce. Speaking of which, we're going to talk about one of the women who grace our poster this year, in line with the theme of the festival, 100 Years of Women Changing the Current. And it is my great honor to introduce two of my colleagues, Linda Siegenthaler and Gladys Giteau. And Linda, you, of course, you have been a mainstay of this festival for many years. You were the person, you and Yuri Siegenthaler created Lawrence History Live. And we'll always be grateful to you and Yuri for that, but you are also a lot of things. You're an economist, you're a local historian, a community activist, and you were the recipient of the 2017 Eartha Dengler Award for your contribution to local history. And it was you who researched the woman you and Gladys were about to talk about. So thank you. And Gladys, you have been, how long have you been with us on the Bread and Roses Festival?
I'm gonna say this is my third year being on the board, but I used to attend all the time when I was a kid.
Oh yes, I remember. And you are you're a teacher, I believe. And where do you teach?
I teach at Phoenix Academy, which is in North Lawrence.
Very, very good. And so you have been, I know you've been involved with many activities in the local community. And you, of course, are one of our great organizers for the festival. And are you a Lawrence native by any chance?
I am.
Very good. What neighborhood did you grow up in?
I grew up in South Lawrence on Bailey Street, which is where I am right now.
Oh, wonderful. Excellent. Well, I guess it's time for you two to take things from here. The theme of your topic is a deep dive into this year's logo, from Lawrence suffragist Ella Findeisen to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So Linda and Gladys, it's all yours.
Thank you, Heartland. Linda, you're muted.
Can't even see anything.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Are we okay now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, this is a picture of Ella Findeisen, which I wanted to start a little late, but let me start. Ella is Lawrence's suffragist, and she lived from 1882 to 1944. The festival is honoring Ella Findeisen for her heroic contributions to labor and the women's suffrage movement. Long forgotten, Ella Findeisen was what we call a grassroots suffragist. It's a link between the struggle for worker rights and the fight for the national right to vote for women. On the labor side, post the 1912 strike, she served as an officer of the German section, Local 20 of the IWW, and remained active in union, suffrage, and socialist-related issues throughout the 1930s. This is her picture, and she was born in Germany, in Saxony, and emigrated with her family to the United States about 1900. She was the eldest of 5 children and lived in Lawrence on Colby Street, lived there her entire life. She worked as a weaver in the mills, and later in her career, she was a bookkeeper in the dairy industry. Her family was actually well known for that. Let me talk a little bit about her involvement in voter suffrage and demonstration. She was an active member of the National Women's Party, which is considered the more radical of the suffragist organization. The National Women's Party was founded in 1913 by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. And their first innovation photo, slide, next slide, is the parade that she formed she created in 1913 on Pennsylvania Avenue, which was the first women-led parade for the vote. She was very innovative, and the next thing they did is create, the most famous was the Silent the Silent Sentinels was created, which was a series of members of the National Women's Party who basically stood at the gates to Woodrow Wilson's White House. Next slide. Next slide. This is an example of the Silent Sentinels photograph taken that Ella was also part of. How did Ella get involved, actually? Well, she was actually a friend of Eleanor Calnan, who was a Methuen suffragist and had been imprisoned twice in the year 1917 as a result of being arrested for picketing at the White House. So she was too weak to go back to the demonstrations in November. And so she asked Ella, could she substitute for her? And Ella accepted immediately and left. The meeting was on November 9th. November 10th, Ella was part of the Silent Sentinel demonstration in front of the White House. Slide, next slide. You can see in this illustration how the Sentinels looked and the message that they carried. Each day they had a different message, and they were there from dawn to dusk, 6 days a week throughout 2017, 2018, and parts of 2019. So this was a very innovative and determined demonstration group, and Ella became part of it. There's another one. Next slide. So Ella is actually demonstrating with her group and is arrested on 1917 in November 11th, and not charged. But on November 14th, she was charged and found guilty of, she was found guilty and charged with obstruction of traffic. She chose not to pay the fine and was sentenced to the Occoquan workhouse, which was in Virginia, about 30 miles from outside of Washington. Occoquan is a very interesting place. It was originally built as a more humane way to hold prisoners, but by the time in 2017, it was no longer the model that Theodore Roosevelt created. So they were transferred directly from Washington to Occoquan, and this night that they were there became known as the Night of Terror. Next photo, next slide. This is the type of jail cell that Ella was subjected to, and Ella and there were 41 colleagues were subject that night and many days after to physical abuse, total lack of privacy, and a really unreasonable director, Whitaker, and the horrible food with vermin. Let me read to you the only original writing I found on Ella. This is her affidavit that she created, was part of a trial for habeas corpus. I arrived at Occoquan November 14th, about 6:30. Mrs. Lewis asked to see Mr. Whitaker, but he did not arrive until 9:30 that night. He refused absolutely to listen to the request we had to make. When Mrs. Lewis tried to speak for us, he ordered her to be seized by two men and forced back from the room. The door was then closed. He then assigned two men to take Miss Weeks, and one was assigned to me. I was gripped very tight and pushed from the room and across the grounds to the men's quarters. It had a barred door and a regular door and no windows, just a transom at the roof. Later, 3 more women were put in with me. 2 slept in a single bed and 2 in a mattress on the floor. When 2 girls were put in a cell across the corridor, Mrs. Brennan motioned to them if they were all right. Whitaker reappeared, immediately came and threatened to handcuff, gag, and straitjacket any one of us who would step to the door again, informing us there would be a guard watching us the entire night. The food I received was unwholesome. Later, when we would return to the district jail, I found vermin in my cell, and here too, the food was very poor and unwholesome. Signed by Ella Findeisen, November 28th, 1917. She served 2 weeks, part of it in the Occoquan and part of it in the district jail. A trial was held for inadequate habeas corpus, and the judge ruled that Ella and the remaining 40 be released. So she was released to home, but it was a very, very difficult experience. This is actually, Ella was also part of a demonstration that took place in 1919 that was actually in Boston. It was in February 1919, when President Woodrow Wilson was arriving in Boston as part of his victory tour on the peace process. So he was encountered by an very active demonstration of the National Women's Party Boston chapter, and Ella participated in that. She certainly received and worked hard for her pin. I wanted to actually close and have a little extra time because, as we all know, the 19th Amendment was passed and effective October 18th, but that didn't ensure that all races, all women, especially women of color, had access to the vote. Women of color continued the struggle for voting rights, facing many barriers to vote in the South: poll taxes, Jim Crow, literacy tests. Not until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and subsequent legislation in the 1970s was equity achieved. We still face barriers in voting even today. I wanted to have some extra time, but I wanted to conclude quoting a labor scholar, Dexter Arnold, who's very well known to people in Bread and Roses. Arnold reminds us that Ella Findeisen was a long-distance runner for social justice and worker rights, and an inspiration for today. Let's not forget our grassroots heroes. Thank you very much.
I didn't even know half of that information.
Well, thank you very much, Linda. Thank you, Gladys. And if you who are watching this have any questions for our panelists, and I see we still have Susan and Rochelle are still here from the previous panel. By all means, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and type them in, and we will relay them. And if I could kick things off in that regard, Linda, I was born in Lawrence and grew up in Methuen, and I certainly remember Findeisen's ice cream very well. That's where I first got to know that name. But as was so often the case in those days, my 1960s childhood, that's all I knew about her. I didn't know that she was a militant suffragist. So thank you for uncovering this very important part of our history, locally and nationally as well. And Gladys, I know you did a lot of research leading up to this festival. What did you discover as you worked as you studied all of this information?
Yeah. So I know I found out about Ella around, I want to say around earlier on this year before COVID hit, because I think somebody on the Bread and Roses board had sent out like a link about her. I think this is when we were deciding we were going to honor her. And I actually did some research and I had my students do some reading because my students were learning about the suffragettes and they were learning about voting rights. So I had my students do an activity about just like what the movement was, and the 19th Amendment was, and how cool it was that we had like a very local connection. I didn't know all that stuff about like Woodrow Wilson, and I didn't understand like how prominent in the movement Ella was. I think the way it was sort of conveyed to me by the few sources that I found was that Ella was just like a normal girl who was just sort of happened to be, you know, in the movement, in the activism, you know what I'm saying? But I didn't realize like what an important role she played as a leader. So I'm glad that I'm here today to learn a lot of that stuff. But yeah, and we also talked about how yeah, like those rights don't extend to women of color. Nowadays, you have other groups that are sort of kept out of the sort of civic category. And yeah, hopefully we can, you know, honor more people who are included into that category.
I would certainly want to make the point that among the issues that were very relevant then and are very relevant now to this very day, to this very afternoon, is the issue of voting rights. That struggle goes on, as we know from things going on right now in this country as we contemplate the presidential election of 2020. So again, the relevance and the importance is right to the present day. And I just want to thank you, Gladys, because as I mentioned before, I grew up in this area. I attended public schools in the Merrimack Valley. And I don't remember hearing much about the strike of 1912, much less that the family that gave us Findeisen's ice cream had an ancestor that was a militant suffragette. I will say this, I was lucky later in my school career. In high school, I had an excellent U.S. history teacher named David Hennessy, who did touch on some of these issues. So, but I think your students, Gladys, today are very fortunate to have you and people like you to give your students the history that I was not given, not just about the local area, but about the whole history of that era, that time, and its connection to the present day. So you are indeed noble to do that, and your colleagues as well. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I feel like I know so much history. Oh, I was gonna say, I know a lot of history because of the board. Like I've been going to the festival since I was a kid. Even just being involved in the board is like where I get so much of my knowledge about this area. So I think I'm lucky to be plugged in this way. So.
Yes, okay. I do have a question for you. Gladys, I would love to hear how you chose the women who are featured on this year's logo.
That's a great question, Hartley. So like I want to say Elizabeth said, this is this year's logo. You can get it on breadandrosesheritage.org. I'm also wearing the shirt. Same sort of logo on the shirt. And we have 6 women featured on it. We have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We have Angela Davis. And I mean, let's see, Angela Davis, we have Marsha P. Johnson, we have Ella Findeisen. This is Ella, for those of y'all who are wondering. We have Isra Hirsi, and we have Greta Thunberg. And so these are 6 women that we were sort of thinking about how do we honor this 100 years of women voting, but also how do we make sure it's inclusive to not just the people who got the right to vote, which would be strictly white women, at the time. So we were like, what are other ways that we see women being engaged in changing the political conversation, changing history in ways that are not simply just like voting or voting rights, or, you know, we were trying to broaden that category so they would include more women who historically weren't being counted. This is actually really important to me because I'm an immigrant. I can't vote. And I have a lot of friends, a lot of communities that are also immigrants and can't vote. But they also, that doesn't mean that they're not fighting for their rights. It doesn't mean that they're not fighting for their communities. It doesn't mean that policies don't affect them, right? So I think it's important to think about what are the other civic ways of engagement. So if you don't know, I think everybody knows who Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is. She's a congresswoman, yeah, from the Bronx. I'm gonna say she's a congresswoman. I feel like I confuse my senators, my congresswomen. Yeah, so she's a congresswoman from the Bronx who is, you know, working on the Green Deal, has a lot of really progressive policies, who is, I think, a beacon for a lot of like Latina women, women of color who want to get into politics and who want to be genuine about it. We have Angela Davis, who was like a theorist and a philosopher and a writer, who's involved with the Black Panthers back in the day, who was imprisoned for a while, and, you know, beat the case and is still alive with us, and is such a treasure, especially in the time when we're talking about abolition. Like, it's really important to have abolitionists and people who've been studying this work for a really long time. So we're very lucky to have Angela Davis still here with us. And then we have Marsha P. Johnson. Marsha P. Johnson was a trans woman who was involved with the Stonewall riots back in 1969, and was one of the first people to fight the police at this gay bar in New York. And that's pretty much how like LGBTQ rights started in, that's sort of like the start of, you know, the revolution for LGBTQ rights in the US, right? And we have a lot of erasure of Marsha P. Johnson because Marsha P. Johnson is a Black trans woman, right? And when we talk about LGBTQ rights, we usually think about like white men and, you know, rich white men and stuff, but it was actually like a Black woman who started that movement, along with Sylvia Rivera, who started the STAR Project, which was really helpful in making sure that trans youth were being taken care of at that time when there was, especially just like an AIDS epidemic that was being ignored by a lot of prominent politicians and leaders. And then we have Ella Findeisen, who we just heard about a lot, so I'm not gonna go into Ella that much. This is Isra Hirsi, who is, I'm pretty sure she hates this, but she's the daughter of Congresswoman Omar from Minnesota. I know that I don't know if y'all are familiar with her, but she's really close with OAC. So she's the daughter of the Congresswoman, but she is herself, she's a climate activist. She is part of, she started a collective, I think it's called something like the Climate Youth Project. Let me just make sure. She started it's called the U.S. Youth Climate Strike. And she's a co-executive director and a co-founder of that organization. And she won awards for her climate activism. And I think it's important for her as well to be featured because, I mean, she's young, she's like 17. And she's an immigrant, like her family's an immigrant family. And I feel like we don't see like young Black girls being called activists for the climate. We don't see them being called environmentalists, right? Usually when we think about environmentalists, like once again, we think about like older white men, right? We think about Emerson and all these other people. But I think it's really important for other young Black girls to see her doing that work, because then you realize like this work is, first of all, relevant to all of us, and second of all, is going to impact communities of color the most. So I love her. She looks exactly like my baby sister. So every time I see her, I imagine like my baby sister out there doing climate work. And then we have Greta Thunberg, who is also a climate activist from Sweden. And she, I don't know if y'all heard, she like took a boat where she was like going across different continents to talk about climate change, because she was like, flying is actually a huge, takes a huge toll on the environment, and how can I, you know, reduce my carbon footprint? And she's also young, she's super young too, and she's so inspiring. She's done some work with ISRA as well. So yeah, we were just thinking about what are other ways to include maybe women that we haven't heard about, younger women, women of color, queer women, abolitionist women, in a way that shows how they've changed the current within the last 100 years. So I hope everybody has fun looking through these and learning about them, because every single one of these women is somebody who has a wealth of knowledge And it's educational to really, to start, researching on your own, because then that information becomes more meaningful. So I hope y'all enjoy it.
Can I say something?
That selection. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Linda.
I just was thinking a little bit more about Ella, and I wanted to share something I didn't say. Ella came from a very modest background, and all the suffragists were offered a silver pin because they had served in jail, and Ella was not able to pay for it. And what I don't know is she probably had a very rough time being so progressive at that time. She was an immigrant, also coming from Germany.
Very good point, Linda. Thank you. We're about to turn things over to our next panel here on Lawrence History Live. But before we go, Gladys, I did get one question for you on the Q&A, and that is, how come being an immigrant you can't vote?
Well, I'm not like naturalized yet.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm not a U.S. citizen yet.
Okay.
But hopefully.
Well, you are certainly more than proving your worth as a citizen, as far as we are concerned. So I look forward to the day when you're on the voting rolls, and your judgments will be a positive factor in our elections. I know. Well, thank you both. Thank you, Gladys. Thank you, Linda, for this very informative session here on Lawrence History Live. And Linda, thank you, and Yuri for inventing Lawrence History Live. We cannot forget that.